The Invisible Kingdom by Rob Ryan. In the living room in our old house, sitting on the mantelpiece, and on all the walls around it, was a collection of photographs of our family. There were pictures of my brothers, my sister, and me, taken when we were all babies and very small children. There were pictures of Mum and Dad, taken before we were born. They looked so young and happy, smiling together for the camera. There were pictures of uncles and aunts and grandparents too, pictures of people that we had known and pictures of people who were already dead before we were even born. Everything we knew about them was from listening to the stories told in this very room, sitting around the fire on cosy Sunday afternoons all winter long. Even then, the stories of some of their lives were beginning to fade, and now I hardly remember any of them at all. Sooner or later, nobody alive on this planet will know anything about any of the people in all of those photographs, and that includes me. But the story in this book isn't about a family that one day will be forgotten. In fact, rather the opposite. The family in this story could tell you all about every single member of it who had ever lived, because this was a royal family, a dynasty of kings and queens who had reigned over. But it was not only the family themselves who knew all the legends of their long-dead relations, so did every woman and every man in the land. It was the law that every child should be taught about the lives of every monarch who had ever reigned. Every boy and girl could tell you about the terrible queen who killed her brother and the frightful king who did away with his sister. There were bad kings who enslaved whole nations and good kings that set them all free. There was a sweet and gentle queen who reigned until she was nearly 100 years old. She was so loved by her people that when she died, every eye in the kingdom wept at least one tear. The life of Lord von Dronus, his tutor, was entirely devoted to serving the royal family. His one and only purpose was to educate the prince, a duty he undertook with immense seriousness. He was never friendly or kind to his solitary pupil, for the simple reason that he had never been instructed to be. He lived his life according to rules, and he believed that they were to be obeyed unto the last letter. Lord von Dronus was in charge of teaching the prince all the lessons any normal child would be taught, but also schooled this shy young boy in all the skills he would need for when he became king. One of the questions that adults like asking children is, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And a child can say anything, probable or improbable, ordinary or extraordinary. But no one ever asked the prince who he would like to be or what he dreamed of doing. Everyone knew he was going to be one thing and one thing only, the king. His destiny was to reign, a job he would take over the day his father died. The prince attended to his lessons earnestly, no matter how strange or unusual they seemed. Was he happy or sad? It was hard to tell. He never really smiled, but then he never really frowned. He never complained about anything. In fact, he was always so busy being lectured to that he never had much chance to speak at all. Another thing that was different about the prince was that he didn't spend a lot of time with his parents. The king and the queen didn't cook breakfast or dinner for him, or dry him roughly in front of the fire after he'd had his evening bath, or read him a story when it was bedtime. All of these things were done by palace servants. The young prince very rarely saw his father. Hardly anyone ever saw the king. He was the shyest, most reclusive monarch who had ever reigned. He only appeared in public a few times a year, and then very reluctantly, and only after much persuading by his ministers. He spent most of his time alone in his library. It had once been a ballroom, but now it was filled with hundreds of shelves containing thousands of books that reached all the way up to the ceiling. As the king was so very elusive, the queen's schedule was twice as busy. Her day was filled with meetings and speeches and talking to her loyal subjects, though she rarely spoke to her most loyal subject of all, her son. From time to time, the queen called upon the prince to attend an official engagement with her. Usually, this meant some standing, followed by some bowing, and rounded off with some smiling. But on one occasion, they left the palace to visit another part of the kingdom. The royal family had their own train that they and their retinue travelled on. Far down below the deepest cellars and basements of the palace, there was a single platform with a single train waiting at it, with only one carriage. It was painted plain black and had dark tinted windows. The train went down a secret tunnel before it joined up with the other train lines. It was through these windows that the prince saw his very first glimpse of the world outside the palace walls. What he saw was nothing that you or I would find particularly fascinating, just the view of the backs of hundreds of little houses as the train passed through the city, gardens filled with washing drying on clotheslines, and sad, abandoned toys. But to the prince, it was like watching a film that proved the existence of an entire civilization from a world that he had only previously heard rumours about. He wanted to know what was happening behind every window. He felt that it would take 100 lifetimes to even begin to understand everything that went on outside the palace walls. As the train moved slowly through the rain, it came to a brief stop, and there, at one of the many windows, stood a small girl, about his age, looking out. The boy stared at her for all of the short time that the train waited there, although he knew she couldn't see him through the tinted glass. He watched her as she gazed out at the rain, and, after all the many years of growing up an only child, he felt a deep longing to be her friend. The palace worked like a huge machine, not run by cogs and wheels, but by courtiers and servants, where every person had their place and position. They knew the people above them who they could look up to and treat with respect, and they knew those below them who they could look down on and order around. At the very bottom of the palace pecking order were the servants who had no one beneath them to boss around, such as the scullery maids and the pot scrubbers. There was even a servant who sat alone all day in the basement, surrounded by boots and shoes. It was his job to clean and polish them all. He was the bootman. Actually, he was not always alone. Occasionally he had a visitor. On one of his lonely wanderings around the palace, the young prince found his way down to the bootman's basement. Every servant in the palace treated the prince with great formality, but here, in the dark and the damp, he finally found a warmer welcome. Still only a young man himself, the bootman was the only person in the palace who felt sorry for the boy, and, although he occupied one of the lowest positions, he spoke to the prince not as the future king, but as a fellow person and eventually a friend. In turn, the young prince was fascinated by the bootman, entranced by the tiniest details of his life outside the palace. The prince wanted to know what colour his front door was painted, whether he preferred to sit upstairs or downstairs in the bus, and what did he do on his day off? What did he eat for breakfast? And so on and so on. Such relentless questioning might have driven anyone else crazy, but the bootman didn't show any signs of impatience. He listened carefully as he carried on with his polishing and answered every question thoughtfully and honestly. One day, the young prince asked the bootman how he managed to remember who all the hundreds of shoes and boots that came in and out of the basement belonged to. The bootman told the prince that he could see the character of the owner in every crease and scuff on every boot and shoe. "I have never given anyone back the wrong pair of boots," said the bootman with considerable pride. "I had to devise a special way of knowing which boot belonged to which foot." The prince looked at the rows and rows of pointed toes and high heels, the boots with buttons and laces and zips. He thought of all the people who worked in the palace and all the different occasions that required a particular colour of shoe or a certain type of boot. He couldn't imagine how the bootman kept his kingdom in order. "Would you like to be the only person in the world to know the secret besides me?" The young boy said yes, so quietly it was almost a whisper. The bootman turned off the light switch and the room became pitch black. In the darkness, a small blue light came on, and suddenly every boot was glowing with a fine, pale blue writing. "You see, I write a description of the owner on each and every shoe, but the writing stays invisible until you shine this special light upon it." The prince blinked in wonder. The bootman laughed. "Now you know the world isn't always what it appears to be."